Hello, I'm Ron Duncan Hart of the Santa Fe Distinguished Lecture Series, and we welcome you to this program today on anti-Semitism with Dr. Günther Jikeli. This has been a terrible month in which we have seen unparalleled violence against Jews in the Middle East and anti-Semitism and Jewish hatred in this country at levels that have surprised and shocked all of us, I think. In America in recent years, we have feared neo-Nazi anti-Semitic rhetoric that has inspired gunmen to attack Jews in synagogues. And now we are hearing anti-Semitic hate speech from the progressive left, inciting hate that is enabling. The fear is that it can be an enabling force for atrocities. We are confronting also the unprofessional use of anti-Zionist and anti-Semitic rhetoric and activities on college campuses and other locations. And these, we fear, contribute to the threats against Jews and Jewish life. As a longtime academic myself, I'm concerned about the things that I'm seeing and that we're all witnessing. We have not seen this level of American backing for a government with a genocidal policy against Jews since the shameful support for Nazis in the 1930s that also had a wave of support in this country. The goal of the Institute for Tolerance Studies, which sponsors this distinguished lecture series, is to address intolerance and hatred of the other. And we value the people of goodwill who support the way of tolerance and coexistence. We thank you for joining us in this concern. This talk is being recorded, and it will be available as a podcast on Spotify and other venues, and as a film on the Jewish Learning Channel. During Dr. Jikeli's talk, I would like to encourage you to use the Q&A function for your questions, which we will address at the end. And I would like to introduce Dr. Günther Jikeli, who was with us in Santa Fe in previous years with the Santa Fe Jewish Film Festival. And it is a pleasure to have you back with us again, although virtually this time. Dr. Jikeli is the perfect person to analyze this surge in anti-Semitic rhetoric and other events in our country now. He is the Erna B. Rosenfeld Professor at Indiana University's Institute for the Study of Contemporary Anti-Semitism and the Bourne's Jewish Studies program. Very interesting to me, and I hope he can speak to this later perhaps, he also runs the research lab on social media and hate. He has been awarded the Raoul Wallenberg Prize in Human Rights and Holocaust Studies and recognized as one of the top 100 people positively influencing Jewish life. His book, The Return of Religious Anti-Semitism, explores the subject of that title, looking at Christian, Islamic, and other aspects of anti-Semitism. And we will hear more about that today, I think. So Dr. Jikeli.
Thank you very much, Ron, for this introduction. I would rather like to be with you for the Israeli or the Jewish Film Festival or some other nice events, but it's true that we live really in dire times, and this is a moment I think we need to reflect on the current developments and think about them deeply and try to understand what's happening. The Hamas massacre in Israel on October 7th and the reactions that followed have shown that the war against the Jews once again has very committed murderers and many supporters around the world. This is happening in a context where the international order is being challenged by various actors who are using anti-colonialist rhetoric against the United States and Israel to advance their own aggressive and expansionist agendas, be it Iran, Russia, China, or terrorist groups such as Hamas, who, of course, is sponsored by Iran. I want to focus today on the impact of all of this on the Western world, and especially on the situation for Jews, and provide an overview of anti-Semitism today as best as I can in this hour that we have. But this is the global context, and it doesn't look like it's going to get any better anytime soon. The Hamas massacre of October 7th was unprecedented in its scale and brutality, certainly the worst pogrom against Jews since the Holocaust, and worse than many pogroms before that. The world now knows exactly what a pogrom looks like, more than ever, I would argue, because the Hamas terrorists made a point of documenting and proudly broadcasting their atrocities. It's still there to see for all of us if we want to look at these horrible images that they broadcasted. Nevertheless, the unequivocal condemnations of this pogrom, without any attempt to justify it directly or indirectly, are the exception rather than the rule. Fortunately, but not coincidentally, these exceptions include the leaders of the most powerful democracies, including the president of this country, Joe Biden. But if you look at the media and many of our institutions on campuses, in also conversations that we have, often with most of these non-Jews then, and in certainly in these conversations on social media, an unequivocal condemnation of this pogrom, this is the exception. So why is that? How can we explain that the reaction to witnessing the mass murder of 1,400 Jews in the most brutal and sadistic way imaginable, the raping, torturing, murdering, and kidnapping of babies, young women, old women, men, almost all civilians, is not one of empathy and unequivocal condemnation? And I would expect this regardless of any political views on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. This kind of targeting of civilians can never be acceptable under no circumstances. But again, empathy and this unequivocal condemnation is the exception. I have thought about the reasons of that and what that means over the past few weeks. I have only two possible explanations, and both are frankly devastating to explain that. So the first is that the idea of humanity, a common humanity, is an illusion, really. We're tribal and don't really care if babies, young women, old women, men, unarmed civilians are raped, tortured, slaughtered, if they're not our own. I kind of still refuse to believe that, so I focus on the implications of the second explanation, which is not much better, though. So, and also put some serious doubts on the idea of a common humanity. The second explanation is that too many people don't care if Jewish babies, women and men are raped, tortured, and slaughtered, especially if they are Israeli. The Jews, including civilians, are somehow guilty. They had it coming, might be the thinking behind it. Perhaps there is not much empathy for the victims because anti-Semitism is so widespread that it prevents people from empathizing with the Jewish victims. That they somehow put the massacre into an anti-Semitic framework, an anti-Semitic view of the world in which the targeted slaughter of Jewish civilians becomes understandable. So much so that some people even side with Hamas terrorists. And many of those people in the West who side with Hamas terrorists would suffer terribly under Hamas rule. So one could argue that this is even against their own interests, at least in the long run, to support these murderers of Jews. I will talk more about these frameworks, these worldviews later, these worldviews that allow people to dehumanize Israelis and Jews, these mindsets that allow anti-Semites to feel good about themselves when they side with Hamas terrorists and disseminate their genocidal slogans. These mindsets that allow people to destroy posters of murdered Israeli children in good conscience, that allow people to target Jews in their neighborhoods in the streets, on campuses, or to hunt Jews in airports, as just happened in Russia, or in a college library, as happened at Cooper Union, or to threaten in social media posts to rape and murder Jewish students on campus and to behead Jewish babies, as just happened at Cornell, and to feel that they are on the right side of history. Targeting and yes, killing Jews is seen as a form of resistance. We can understand the massacre of Jews in Israel, they say, because the murderers have been oppressed by Israel for so long. They want freedom, they say, and we must understand the violence in the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, in which Palestinians are fighting for their rights. So let me be clear, this Hamas slogan, Palestine will be free from the river to the sea, is a call for genocide against Israelis. And this should be clear to everyone by now who has only the slightest idea of geography and who has opened the news since October 7th. Those who use this slogan are not only inciting violence, they're inciting genocide. Moreover, Hamas has shown what freedom means to them. It means the freedom to kill Jews indiscriminately. This is the freedom that anti-Semites crave, the freedom to murder Jews. The anti-Semite wants death, wants the murder of Jews, as Jean-Paul Sartre said already in 1944. And Hamas is clearly a death cult. What kind of vision is that for the future, even for Palestinians? The call for freedom for Palestine has become now associated with Hamas. What kind of freedom is meant in this context, if not freedom to kill Jews? Freedom from Israeli occupational forces? Gaza has not been occupied by Israeli forces between September 2005 and now. It is true that Gazans are not free to choose their leaders, free to express their opinions, free to determine their own lives. But the biggest obstacles to that kind of freedom has been Hamas, not Israel. And even if we look at the West Bank, which has been under Israeli occupation since 1967, before that it was occupied by Jordan, by the way. So if we look at the situation in the West Bank, it is doubtful that freedom from Jews, including Israeli soldiers, so freedom from occupation, and even the evacuation of all Jewish settlements, homes, villages, and towns in the West Bank, if that would translate really into more freedom for the lives of Palestinians, who would govern this territory then, and what would be the impact on human rights there? In any case, this uncritical dissemination of Hamas slogans, certainly the slogan from the river to the seas, but also the Freedom for Palestine slogan, at least smacks of support for Hamas. Anyone interested in the freedom of Palestinians in a democratic sense should add freedom for Palestine from Hamas. But I rarely hear this in the media or on campuses for that matter. And let me talk briefly about another slogan that we see now a lot, including on social media that we monitor in our research lab that Ron mentioned. The slogan, "Prevent a genocide in Gaza," says. So that is this accusation that Israel is committing genocide against the Palestinians. This accusation has become one of the most potent charges against Israel in the current war of public opinion, shared in millions of messages on social media. The accusation, however, is a perverse inversion of the facts. In fact, Hamas' massacre of civilians and its war against the Jews clearly fits the United Nations definition of genocide. The UN definition reads, I quote, "Genocide means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group as such. A, killing members of the group. B, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group." And it concludes with E, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. The intent to destroy the group and to take action to do so is essential. Hamas officials have repeatedly made it clear, including in their founding charter, that the intention is to wipe out Israel and that they intend to kill all Jews. and they've put this into practice as best as they can. So there's no doubt about their intent, even if so-called pro-Palestinian supporters downplay or deny it. Against this background, the accusation of genocide against Israel becomes even more grotesque and has the effect of covering up the genocidal anti-Semitic terrorism of Hamas. The accusation of genocide against Israel is also part of a longer trend of Holocaust inversion. Jews are accused of being the new Nazis in order to prevent Jews from claiming victimhood and to minimize the systematic murder of 6 million Jews. This accusation is an anti-Semitic slander, and to say that Gaza is equivalent to Auschwitz or to the Warsaw Ghetto is not only nonsense, but an expression of anti-Semitism. But again, we're hearing these anti-Semitic slogans, we are seeing attacks against Jews around the world more than ever after the most brutal and horrific attack against Jews since the Holocaust. Let me show you some of the worst reactions that I have seen after the pogrom in Israel. And it's really just a small fraction that illustrates some of the aspects of it. Let me try to share now the screen. So here's a reaction 2 days after the massacre on October 9th, press release by the Human Rights Watch. And you can read it in an article that was just published on in Fathom, a journal that was written by Joel Steinbeck, that goes into detail there and about the history also of Human Rights Watch in that regard. So they immediately blamed, 2 days after the massacre, they put the blame on Israel. Right? And that was before there was a forceful response by Israel. So they said, the takeaway is that Israeli authorities have systematically repressed Palestinians for decades, and inhuman acts committed against Palestinians as part of policy to maintain the domination by Jewish Israelis of the Palestinians amount to the crimes against humanity of apartheid and persecution. Well, that was some of the reactions. And then what I was particularly shocked about was when here we go. One of the Hamas leaders, I think it was on the Tuesday or Wednesday after the massacre, called for a day of rage on the following Friday, the worldwide Day of Rage. And pro-Palestinian protesters responded to this call from Hamas for Day of Rage. And you see an image then on that Friday after the massacre of demonstrators in New York. And that led to many Jewish schools, kindergartens, Jewish institutions to shut down on that day because of fear of violent attacks around the world, not only in the United States, but also in Europe in many places. And here you see the rallies, apparently so-called pro-Palestinian rallies, with often very explicit anti-Semitic rhetoric. This picture was taken at a rally in Warsaw, Poland, October 21, and the student carrying this anti-Semitic poster, "Keep the world clean of Judaism or Israel," whatever that you want to interpret this. She's a medical student in Warsaw. And here you see something from one of the finest, or projected on one of the finest universities in this country, George Washington University. And that was from October 24. The glorification of the Hamas terrorist projected onto the building. "Glory to our martyrs," it reads. And then divestment from Zionist genocide now on another building. On the same building, but another angle. So these kind of reactions we see on some of universities. We also see that from even academics, and you might want to, if you want more of that, want to see more of that, but want to watch this compilation a documentation by Gerard Tenney and Adam Fuller, who made a video about some of the these reactions by academics that downplay the atrocities or try to explain it. One leading academic saying the Hamas Charter has zero relevance. These kind of reactions we see. If we go online, so that was I think that, yes, that was the weekend. This, what you see in the middle here, this image from a white nationalist Jew zone 4chan that was on the weekend of the massacre, using this kind of imagery with the paraglider to glorify the terrorists. And this kind of frog here, what you see on the paraglider, is often used by white nationalists to portray themselves. So saying basically that white nationalists should be happy to do the same thing over Jerusalem. So we can see that. And also in this, some of the posters that called for pro-Palestinian rallies, they use these paragliders, and there's two of them here. That is, of course, an endorsement of this terrorist act. And we see around the world, in this country, but also many other countries, an increase, a huge increase in anti-Semitic acts after October 7th, after the Hamas massacre. This is from the ADL, who has been monitoring anti-Semitic incidents for many decades, and they compared it with the same period a year earlier, and saw almost 400% increase of anti-Semitic incidents. And reports, I just read reports from Germany and from France, they point to similar developments. And this is, of course, has a long history, these anti-Semitic incidents. If we look at collections of data on anti-Semitic incidents, it's difficult to do that. So the Cantor Center has been doing this for a while. They try to do it globally to compile these data. What I think we can see that at least in European countries, there has been a clear increase of anti-Semitic incidents since the early 21st century. And I would argue that in the United States, now 20 years later, we will see the same development, or we have already seen the beginning of this development, that there's an increase. And it's often in the years when there is violence in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that anti-Semites feel emboldened to act out their anti-Semitic beliefs. So here you see some numbers from Germany that show in recent years an increase. We don't see collection here before the 21st century, but there's a clear increase, and the year 2021 was the highest recorded. That was related to also the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in May 2021. And the expectation is that this year it's going to be much higher. We see in the United Kingdom an increase over the year. Again, last year was a little bit lower than the year before, 2021, related to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And you see that also in other years, for example, 2009. But the level of anti-Semitic incidents and violence has been increasing steadily, even in years where there's no major conflict recorded in the, or not in the media, conflict in the between Israel and Palestinian groups. And here, the numbers for France, you see it more drastically, the difference between the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century, huge increase in anti-Semitic incidents, acts, and also an increase of the violence of it. And back to the United States, so we have two agencies collecting data. The ADL collects incidents, and the FBI collects hate crimes. And last year was a record year of anti-Semitic incidents recorded by the ADL, but also by the FBI. And if you look at more numbers from the hate crimes, if you compare that to other groups who are attacked, minorities who are attacked in this country, if you put this in relation to the number of people who belong to these minority groups, you see that in almost all years, Jews have been more likely to become victim of a hate crime than any other religious or ethnic group. Very few people think that this is the case, but the numbers that at least the FBI puts out there show that clearly. So a lot of this violence is very extreme. People have been murdered in Europe, mostly by jihadists, and in the United States so far by white supremacists. And we don't have time really to go into all these incidents, but in many of these incidents there was some reporting in the media, but very often clearly what you see, for example, at the in Paris, the murder of Ilhan Halimi, the Jewish community felt very lonely in society. There was not much support. That was also true in 2012 in Toulouse. People on this call might remember that horrific shooting at a Jewish school where 3 very young children were murdered at close range, shot by a jihadist, and also the father and teacher also in that school, one of the children. And the Jewish community felt mostly alone. And there was also an understanding for this kind of jihadist action, framing it as part of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And we saw many other incidents. In the United States, I think the watershed that shook to the core of Jewish communities in this country, and since then we have seen also an increase in the necessity of putting security at synagogues, Jewish schools, was the terrorist attack of the Tree of Life in Pittsburgh, 2018. But that so it was the most horrific murder and terrorist attack against Jews directly in this country, the 21st century. If you don't count 9/11, which you could also argue it's an anti-Semitic attack in parts at least. But that was not the last one. So this is an ongoing threat, of course. And if we look at surveys how Jews perceive anti-Semitism, if they have been personally experienced, if they have personally experienced anti-Semitism, so that's a survey that's already some years old, and it's not likely that the numbers have gone down. It's rather likely that they have gone up. But in Europe, in 12 countries where members of Jewish communities were surveyed, almost 40% said that they have experienced personally some form of anti-Semitic harassment, and some even violence and vandalism. In the United States, is a little better, but not much better. 23% said they became target of anti-Semitic remarks in person or online, an additional 21%. And there have been attempts to see who is most likely then, who is at risk, especially in the Jewish communities. So if you're visibly Jewish, you're more likely to be attacked on the streets. If you're male and if you're young, you're more often more exposed. And that has led to a situation where now many Jews in Europe, but also increasingly so in the United States, including at our finest universities, try to hide their Jewish identity because they're in fear. They avoid wearing symbols that would reveal their Jewish identity, which in itself is already a devastating development. So we have, of course, vibrant places, vibrant Jewish communities in Europe and the Americas, but increasingly they need to be protected. There has been a situation for decades in Europe, but increasingly that is the situation in the United States. So where's this? What are global trends? So we have seen an anti-Semitic level of anti-Semitism that is steadily increasing, often more so in times of violent conflict in Israel. We have seen that some of the anti-Semites, they organize themselves. So it's not only individual acts, and they plan violence, and these are mostly jihadists and white supremacists. Then we can see that there's an anti-Semitic discourse that is increasing, that is on the margins, of course, very radical, but drifting into the mainstream. We see a huge increase in online anti-Semitism that has become the most potent disseminator of anti-Semitic propaganda. That, of course, has led to an unease in Jewish communities across the globe. We have some positive developments that politicians, some politicians realize, policymakers realize that this is a very dangerous development, of course, for Jewish communities, but more in general for society at large. And also that still anti-Semitism is condemned in principle, but what's lacking is then often it's lacking to say what exactly is then needs to be condemned. And so when I did this presentation a year ago, a similar presentation, I put in that many anti-Semites have not yet found the overarching political theme, that anti-Zionism can be identified as one potential of these themes, but I change it now to that they have found, at least many of them, an overarching political theme, and that's anti-Zionism or anti-Israelism. So what are the ideological sources of anti-Semitism that explains what I was talking earlier, this kind of framework, this worldview that really impedes people to see this, to just condemn the brutal attack against civilians, whatever the political views are. So I think there are four relevant frameworks, worldviews that play a role here. And that depends, of course, on the individual, what they pick, what worldview they're in. But this might explain, at least to some degree, why people do not show the empathy that I would expect, frankly, from everybody hearing about this kind of massacre. So one is the anti-imperialist, anti-Zionist worldview, an ideology that is supposedly based on Marxism, but a certain perhaps simplification of Marxism, of an anti-imperialist worldview that only sees the United States and then Israel as responsible for imperialism and colonialism, and maybe also the other European forces, but they are made as they are seen as those who are responsible around the world for oppression. And this is in a worldview now that a very simplified idea of how society works and what the problem in society is. If the only problem is the oppressors, and we have to free the oppressed from the oppressors, so dividing people everywhere into oppressed people and oppressor peoples. This is the kind of context where then these means, this horrific means of targeting civilians, somehow seem to be justified. We see a framework of white nationalism that still has references to neo-Nazism, essentializing ethnicities and peoples, and this makes Jews responsible for what goes wrong in the world. So we see what's often labeled as the Great Replacement theory. The white nationalists, they have a problem, of course, explaining why our societies become more and more diverse, why members of minority groups become very successful if they are supposedly inferior. So the way they explain it is with an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory that they say the Jews orchestrate all of that. They are responsible for that. They bring in the immigrants, and they are responsible for our societies developing into more and more diverse societies. And they're against this. And they have, for decades, also made a lot of propaganda against what they call the Zionist occupied government. So they join the anti-imperialist ideologues, making so-called Zionists responsible for everything. And what these anti-imperialists and white nationalists think of when they talk about Zionists is not the Zionists that I would think that most people on this call think of when they talk about Zionists. So not people who believe that Jews should have their own state. But for them, Zionists, this is a global conspiracy that is out there to run the world. And then we have Islamism, of course, that has been very forceful and has been responsible for a lot of anti-Semitic attacks since its birth with the Muslim Brotherhood in the 1930s, and Qutb's writings of our struggle with the Jews. So Islamism, a core of Islamist ideology is that we are in a global war between Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, and the Jews are the main enemies of Islam. And then there's Christian anti-Semitism that is still there, that has had a 2,000 years of history. So some of the old stereotypes are still powerful, such as this accusation that Jews allegedly are responsible for killing of Jesus, and also these supersessionist ideas that says the old covenant, that is the covenant between God and the people of Israel, is not valid anymore. Judaism doesn't have any legitimacy anymore and is now superseded by Christianity. There has been some reform in the churches since the 1960s, where it says the covenant between the Jewish people and God is still valid, but some of the Christian denominations still believe in what has been around for almost 2,000 years, that this is not the case, and that Judaism doesn't have any place anymore in the world. So these things are still powerful, and a lot of this comes back. The anti-Semitism in force comes back in form of religious framework. Yes, I think this we can skip now, but I want to focus a little bit on the Islamic sources in 2 or 3 minutes, and then we can open it up maybe for Q&A. Looking at Islamic anti-Semitism or Muslim anti-Semitism and the different sources there, because of course Hamas is an Islamist organization, and I would still, and maybe want to discuss it also in the Q&A, still argue strongly that there's a big difference between Islamists and Muslims. But of course, not all Muslims are anti-Semites, but many buy into Islamist thoughts. Islamism has become a very powerful way of interpreting Islamic sources. So if we look at the history of Jew hatred in Islamic tradition and culture, we can find a lot, as we can also find a lot as in Christian traditions and cultures and texts. We can also see that in the 19th century, there was an introduction of Christian anti-Semitic themes by Christian missionaries, such as the blood libel. Then we can see that many of these Islamist groups, such as the Muslim Brotherhood, they had an affinity to Nazism, and they bought into the anti-Semitic propaganda that Nazis disseminated widely from 1939 to 1945. And you can read Jeffrey Herf's works on that, or Matthias Kunzel's works on that, how the Nazis really tried to indoctrinate the Arab world with their radio shows. Right? And then, of course, the Islamist interpretations of Islamic texts has been very powerful, and they have made this point saying the Jews and the Muslims have always been enemies and should always be enemies. And they use some of the text in the Quran. So the Quran is full of contradictions, of course, as most religious texts. But we can see in some of these tropes that do play a role, and that Islamists use a lot, saying in the Quran, Jews are Muslims' enemies, or Jews have forged the scripture. That's how Islamists explain, and it's even explained in the Quran in a way, why a lot of the stories that we can read in the Torah, or with Christians is the Old Testament, that are very similar to stories in the Quran, but not quite. Why are they different? Because this was forged by the Jews in the Torah. This is the kind of accusation there. So we find a lot of, if you want, sources that can be used in the Quran to justify hatred against Jews. Right, and I want to finish with that these anti-Semitic ideas are drifting now from the extremes to the mainstream, and it's really now, I would say, you can argue maybe it's not the drifting from the fringes to the mainstream, but maybe it's in the mainstream, it's just showing up more crudely and more violently on the fringes. So I don't really know now anymore which direction it goes. So this is the kind of state where we are. I think this is a very a time where we have to speak clearly and speak out against the anti-Semitic slogans that we see, those who side with anti-Semites. It's important to stand up against the anti-Semites, because many of these anti-Semites, and we've seen that also in universities, if they're called out, they're also cowards, and then they keep quieter. They need to be kept in check. So it's important to unite against these people who side with Hamas or use other opportunities to express their anti-Semitic sentiments that they have anyway. So this is a moment that they seem to get, they think they can get away with expressions of anti-Semitism, with attacking of Jews. But it might also be a moment where people who not only want to, of course, want to protect Jewish communities, but also see the dangers of this kind of thinking for democracy at large, to put an end to these kind of ideologies. So I would like to open this up. I would be really interested in what listeners and viewers have to say on that. And I see there are already some Q&A questions, but Ron, maybe you can guide me through it.
Yes, Raymond Termini asks, to what extent is anti-Semitism on college campuses caused by professors who do not teach and students who do not want to learn the accuracy of terms like apartheid state? Okay.
Yeah, so it's...
And he goes on to
the
second question about ideology and liberal neutrality. So there, yeah.
Okay, yes, of course, this is... it's not only coming from students. So this kind of ideology is coming from professors as well. And I don't understand what Raymond is saying by who do not teach. I mean, most of the professors, they have to teach. So they teach this kind of ideology in the classrooms. And it depends on the campuses. I mean, on some campuses, we have more of these professors who teach in this kind of anti-imperialist framework, and they often even do so if it's not related to their area of expertise. So we see that, and this the accuracy of terms. This is a huge problem that has been addressed for some time. If we are not able to really say, to determine what we want to say, if we don't use clear terms, then we cannot, of course, fight anti-Semitism or have even a concept of how the world is like. So we need to be accurate with the terms. But this obviously is not used in political propaganda, and the accusation that Israel is an apartheid state is a political, it's just used as a political propaganda.
You know, there are a couple of comments and questions that relate to the fact that the concern about, from the progressive side of thought, this anti-Semitism that's emerged, and of course, in recent years, you point out in the slides, you know, we've been dealing with the right-wing kind of proto-neo-Nazi rhetoric that has actually led to attacks on synagogues and Jews. But the concern now is that it seems to be coming from both sides, from the progressive left and from the right. This is unusual, I think. I don't know if you can comment on that.
Well, this is not unprecedented.
On the left, you know?
Yes, absolutely. This is not unprecedented. If you look, I mean, in even if you look at Germany, that of course has a huge history of neo-Nazis and the neo-Nazis, but even there, for some time in the 70s and 80s, violent attacks, terrorist attacks were done by groups from the far left. And the rhetoric, this anti-Zionist rhetoric that is used by anti-Semites to attack Jews, because if you demonize Israel and say this is an evil state, so then anybody who sides with this evil state is also evil. And of course, for Jews, for most Jews, Israel is part of the Jewish identity. So it of course it makes sense. It's in the religion, it's in the culture, it's in even in personal connections. Many Jews have family in Israel, and so they do not condemn, they do not see Israel as evil. So they do not share this kind of maniac worldview that Israel is responsible for all evil. But this is what are the demands by this anti-imperialist, that demand that everybody sees Israel as evil, and those who don't, they are then attacked. And this kind of anti-Israelism, this kind of anti-Zionism that attacks, then the impact is mostly on local Jews, right? So they get attacked. So we see that, and this has a long history in the Soviet anti-Zionist propaganda that was already there in the 1950s, and that got a huge push in after 1967, because then the Soviet Union sided with the Arab states and pushed this agenda. And this was bought by many groups on the left in the Western world. They just took it one-on-one, this anti-Zionist propaganda coming from the Soviet Union. And interestingly, we find a lot of this rhetoric, the same rhetoric from 50 years ago, today. There's another good article in Fathom that explains this, where all these tropes, these anti-Zionist tropes, are coming from. So they have a long history. It's not new. It's just that they have not been so far not active in violence as much as the far right, and not maybe as openly anti-Semitic as the far right. But it's not a new phenomenon.
No. Howard Friedman asked about the uptick in anti-Zionism in the 21st century that your slides were showing in almost every case. Can you comment on that uptick? Why did it suddenly start happening 23 years ago? No.
Mm-hmm. So it's a big puzzle why we see in the 21st century now the rise of anti-Semitism. I have two possible explanations. One is that the memory of the Holocaust is fading, that for some time a lot of people genuinely thought that anti-Semitism is really bad, and we should really prevent it from growing again after what we've seen, the horrors we've seen, what happened during the Holocaust. So that is fading a bit. And then it's a global context where, and that's why I put this in the beginning, what we see, that those who contest the current international order. So if we look at the rhetoric that Russia is using, for example, or that Iran is using, and also China is using, they are using anti-imperialist rhetoric, and they challenge that. And we saw in the early 2000s, that was the beginning of the Second Intifada. So there was violence in Israel against Israeli civilians, perpetrated also by Islamists, who blew themselves up in cafes and in buses and so on. Many people will remember that. But that also led to a lot of attacks then against Jews around the world. So I think we have to see that in this context. And the memory of the Holocaust has also been under attack since some time. So yes, there have been memorials, by the way, starting only really in the 1990s, and discussions in some countries about their own responsibilities of during the Holocaust. But that was at a time when most of the perpetrators were either very old or already dead, so it didn't hurt so many people then anymore. But there's also backlash, apparently, so that people have this, now want to accuse the Jews of doing the same thing with the Palestinians and thereby downplaying the Holocaust. So we see this also as a development. But I think it's more the global developments and the usefulness of this kind of rhetoric that allows too many of these organizations to get away with that.
You know, there's a question from Betsy Messica about the involvement of her phrase is foreign Muslim countries, but taking the question, referring back to a program that you recently had about the involvement of Islamic groups in the United States and the role that they have had in anti-Semitic rhetoric. I don't know if you can comment on that. There's and this is not to get into an anti-Islamic thing, but it's but there is a reality of some groups that do have anti-Semitic messages in the US. I don't know if you can comment on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you look at one of the biggest Muslim organizations in the United States, CARE, they have had some connections to terrorists, even to Islamist terrorists. The problem with many of the Muslim organizations in Western countries, in the United States, in Canada, in Germany, in France, in Britain, in Belgium, is that many of the Muslim organizations, they are influenced by Islamist organizations, but they are not representative of Muslims in these countries. It just happens, for various reasons, that Islamist organizations, mostly the Muslim Brotherhood, but also others, have been successful in influencing the major Muslim organizations in Western countries. And we see these connections. And there has not been much monitoring of that, including the teaching that is happening in some of these mosques that have some affiliation with Islamist organizations. And it's also partly due to influence from foreign countries, that's correct, that they send money to sponsor certain imams that are then Islamists. It has also to do with the fact that more moderate Muslims and more secular Muslims, they usually don't have an interest in organizing themselves in Muslim organizations. They want to go to a mosque maybe once a month or maybe even once a year or so and use the infrastructure and have a community there. But they don't, if they want to invest in organizing community, that might, I don't know, go to a football club or something, but not necessarily in religious terms. So political Islam, they have a systematic advantage there. But these Islamist organizations that are not representative, and that surveys have shown that, of Muslims in these countries. But the major organizations still have ties to Islamist organizations. That's correct.
There's a question from Yehuda Pat about the anti-Semitism that has been developing in the Black community in the United States. And I might add to that question about what is the role of anti-Semitism with rappers, Kanye West and all of this. Can you comment on that?
Yes. The Nation of Islam, this Farrakhan, has had a huge negative impact on that. He has many of his speeches include anti-Semitic attacks against Jews, anti-Semitic rhetoric. Very importantly, this claim that the Jews were responsible for the slave trade, that has there's a book about this that has been disseminated by the Nation of Islam, and because I think that's also because a lack of leadership today in the Muslim communities. This people like Farrakhan are seen as leaders for the Black community, and they're not only their image of Jews, but also the views of women, and it's really not at all, I would say, in line with progressive values, if you want. But it's still seen as the Farrakhan is still seen as one of the biggest influential leaders in Black communities, and this dissemination of this rhetoric that, or accusations such as the Jews were responsible for the slave trade, which is nonsense, hasn't had an impact.
Daniel Ben Ami asks if you could comment on the role of identity politics in this latest surge in anti-Semitism, and referring specifically to the idea that Jews are, that when it goes back to the Durban conference and all that, that Jews are in the white oppressor sector of the world society, whereas Palestinians are not. When the actual fact is, we know that Israel is a predominantly Middle Eastern country, and so that it's we get this categorization, that Israel is white and Palestinians are not, when it clearly is not the case. But I don't know. Can you comment on this identity politics thing, that larger concept?
Yeah, so I mean, maybe it shows also how maybe frankly how stupid some of these concepts are, identity politics concepts. It depends on what you mean by that. So, but if you mean by that you put people that in categories of oppressors and oppressed peoples, this is and this by their ethnic affiliation or ethnic identity, this is I mean, not only stupid, but it's also dangerous. So where do you put Jews in there? It doesn't fit. These categories, they don't fit. So Jews are then often put in the camp of the oppressors. They're not seen as oppressed people, even with their more than 2,000 years of history of being discriminated, slaughtered, and so on. It's an ideology that we see there that just doesn't make sense. If you see the world and if you try to explain the injustices that we see around us, and of course there are many injustices in this country, and there's racism in this country, but if you explain everything through the lens of identity politics, then you get to results that then Jews are put in the camp of oppressors and they need to be fought, and regardless of what then the individual then does, is attacked. So yes, it has an impact, and it is within this framework of this anti-imperialist worldview that this identity politics usually is is happening.
Yeah, yeah. For one last question, Erica Rimson asks, and other people repeat the same question, is can you suggest or comment on effective means of speaking to anti-Semitic people today? How does the Jewish community respond to what's happening?
They need to be called out. They need to be called out unequivocally that that this is anti-Semitic, that's not acceptable. And I mean, few will. We did an experiment, by the way, in our research lab. We responded to anti-Semitic posts, comments, and said we tried different things, saying, "Oh, this is anti-Semitic," calling it out, or "This is this hurts us," or giving some facts, or trying with irony. Nothing really works to convince them, but it's important that they find a position, that others see that this is not acceptable, that they're called out, and then hopefully there's a message to others, if that's visibly and forceful enough, that they don't even engage in such kind of activities. So we need to clearly call it out. And most of the anti-Semites, the way they think, they believe in what they say. They believe that there's Jewish power. So if they get a backlash, some of them, many of them, they will they will maybe not dare to, at least some of them, speak in that way again. But if they are emboldened, and that's why we see why after each big anti-Semitic attack, after each violence against Jews, we see more anti-Semitism. So anti-Semites feel emboldened by other anti-Semites who get away with that. So the message has to be, you don't get away with anti-Semitism.
Yes, thank you. Dr. Günther Jikeli, thank you so much for being with us today, and opening these windows to look at what is definitely a major issue of concern today, and helping us look at the facts about anti-Semitism that hopefully we can all take with us and be able to use. So, Dr. Jikeli, thank you so much for being with us today, and we look forward to other conversations in the future. So,
thank you, Ron.